Hello, I'm Fred Reeves, the rabbi of KAM Isaiah Israel, and I welcome you to our Yom haShoah commemorative service. If you have participated in our commemorations before, you will notice a few differences between this year and years past. The most obvious is that we are not live, but rather we have a pre-recorded format that has allowed us to bring together opportunities that would not have otherwise been available, such as Chaya Roth's children, both being able to share some of her memoir, or Sylvia Myers being interviewed by her granddaughters. You will also notice that some elements have remained the same. We have invited children of the community to light memorial candles. We share in the stories of survivors of the Holocaust, and we will be moved by the beautiful singing of the cantors of Hyde Park. This year, our commemoration is entitled Naming, Honoring, Remembering. Ruth Bloom and the others who work so diligently to put this commemoration together every year are fully aware that the responsibility of keeping the stories of the Holocaust, both of those lost and those who survived, is falling more and more to those who did not experience it firsthand. While we are fortunate to still have with us some who survived the Holocaust, so many have died in recent years. And while we feel their absence dearly, we also know that keeping their stories going is essential. So in this commemoration, we will be naming people and naming experiences that they went through. While everyone's story is uniquely theirs, our intent is not to tell one story, but through naming individuals to communicate the story of our people. The sharing of stories is a way of honoring those whom we loved, who suffered through this terrible hardship. By honoring them, we show the next generation the importance of keeping these stories alive and the important Jewish values behind them. And of course, remembering. Our duty never to forget, so that something like this will never happen again. We are in the wake of Passover, and just as the Haggadah tells us to think of ourselves as having experienced the Exodus, so that we will remember it, so too must we put ourselves in the place of those who experienced the Holocaust. We will remember. Our children will remember. Generations to come will remember. As we turn to tell the story, we start by remembering that Jews lived in Eastern Europe for 1,000 years, sometimes experiencing persecution, but more often living happy, productive lives. Our own beloved rabbi, Jacob J. Weinstein, and his wife Janet visited his extended family in Poland in 1937. While looking at this photo later in his life brought him to tears because all of his cousins had perished, we can see in this picture how happy he is to be with them and how happy they are to be with him.
In dem Beis HaMikdash, in a Winkel Cheder, sitzt die Almone Bat Zion allein. Ihr ben Yochid Liedelen wiegt sie Geseder und singt ihm zum Schlafen a Liedele schön. Und der Jidel as Wiegele steht a Klor weiß Siegele, das Siegele ist geworden handeln. Das wird sein dein Beruf, Rosh es mit Mandeln. Schlaf, Jehidele, schlaf. Schlaf, Jehidele, schlaf. In dem Beis Hamikdash, in a Winkel Cheder, sitzt die Almone bat Zion allein. Ihr ben Yochidel idele, witzig Seder, und singt ihm zum Schlafen a Liedele schön. Und Jidele Zwiegele steht a Chlor weiß Siegele, das Siegele ist geworden Handeln. Das wird sein dein Beruf, Rojinkes mit Mandeln. Schlaf, Jehidele, schlaf. Schlaf, Jehidele, schlaf.
We are honored to join you at this Yom haShoah commemoration. We are Miriam Rader Roth and Ari Roth, children of Dr. Chaya Roth and Walter Roth, Zichrono Livracha.
Our family, including our sister Judy Roth, who can't be with us today, has been part of Congregation Rodfei Tzedek for 3 generations. And though we don't live in Hyde Park anymore and Chaya lives downtown, we feel a strong kinship with the Hyde Park, Kenwood, South Shore community.
Our mother, Dr. Chaya Roth, was born in 1934 in Berlin. She was on the run with her mother and sister throughout the war and was a hidden child in France and Italy. At the age of 8, in 1942, after she had been captured and then released by the Vichy police, she vowed to record her family's story. 66 years later, she fulfilled this vow and published The Fate of Holocaust Memories. Together with the voices of her mother, Chana Horowitz-Diller, and her sister, Gita Horowitz-Faderstein, they detail their traumatic and heroic journey during the Shoah.
Chaya, Chana, and Gita are master storytellers. Their commitment to recounting, recording, and transmitting their stories has been steadfast. Our children and extended family know the stories well, and thanks to Chaya's book, now translated into Italian, people worldwide know her story.
Our mother had a steadfast commitment to transmitting her story. In a toast at my wedding, she shared, "It's not just about telling your own story, the way you have invented it, the way you have created it, and the way you have felt it, and the way you have dreamt it, but it's about telling it to someone else. Tell it to your friends, tell it to your students, tell it to your patients, tell it to your colleagues, and tell it to your children. Transmit what you have created, and transmit what you've received from others before you."
Today we will read an account written by our grandmother, Chana Horowitz-Diller, and published in our mother's book about the murder of our grandfather, Aaron Jacob Horowitz, in September 1938 at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The photo you see is of the Appellplatz, a gathering place where inmates were made to stand for long periods of time at the whim and will of the Nazis.
Papa was murdered on his way to the camp's Appellplatz 8 days after he arrived. At Appell, roll call, inmates were rushed out from their barracks early in the morning to stand while their names were called. Sometimes they stood for hours, and in the evening, they had to stand the same way until each person was called. The Danziger, that is our cousin from Danzig, came to see me after he was set free and told me what had taken place. Early one morning, rushing out to Appel, Papa had stumbled. A Nazi guard kicked him for not walking fast enough. The jolt caused him to stumble and fall. When he fell, he cried out, Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel. The Shema is the most important prayer in the Jewish prayer book and declares the oneness of God. Hearing the Hebrew incantation, the guard hit him again. With each blow, Papa cried out the Shema, and the blows kept coming. Papa was not a strong man, so after all those beatings, his heart gave out. He was only 41 years old. I found out about Papa's death when Annie Friedberg, the woman who was our Spaziererin, that is the woman who took the children on their daily walks, intercepted a telegram from the police, and it read, on September 19th, 1939, our own Yaakov Horowitz died. Cause of death, heart attack. On September 21st, I was summoned to receive Papa's body. When the Gestapo called me, I thought I was to identify the body. I took Gita with me, who at age 9 was old enough to understand, and also my grandfather Itche came with us. Chayala stayed home with Fräulein Friedberg because at age 5, I thought she was too young to see all this. As we entered the room into which the Gestapo had ushered us, I saw a box in the middle of the floor, a box so small it could not possibly hold the body of a grown man. The Nazis must have cut him up into pieces, I thought. There was no other explanation.
Hannah Diller's testimony continues. The Tahara. My grandfather asked the Gestapo men to open the crate so he could do the ritual for the Tahara, the ritual cleansing and preparation for burial. The men refused. You may not touch this box, was the retort. I was convinced that their refusal meant that they were under strict orders to not reveal what had been done to Papa. My grandfather paused. He considered what to do next. Then he performed the most heart-rending mitzvah of his life. He waited, asked for a cup of water, and then said, Ribono shel olam, Master of the universe, since I cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Tahara Kedin B'Kedat, the obligation of purification of the dead according to our law and religion, I will pour a drop of water on every nail that hammered this coffin shut to symbolize the washing of the body of Aaron Jacob Horowitz, and that will have to suffice. My grandfather, cup in hand, poured a drop of water onto every nail that had been hammered into the wooden crate. There were so many holes and drops of water, each accompanied by a prayer. The Gestapo stood and watched. No one dared to rush him. My grandfather said as many prayers as were needed. Gitele and I were holding on to each other. We witnessed it all, and we will never forget.
The burial. It was a cold and somber day. I could barely walk, and Gita almost fainted. Someone had to hold her up as we were walking on the grounds of the cemetery. The Gestapo kept their eyes on us from the time of the Tahara until the box was put into the ground in the Jewish cemetery of Adas Yisrael. At the gravesite, my grandfather said more prayers, and he recited the Kaddish, the prayer that sanctifies the Almighty and is recited in remembrance of the dead. We remained standing, and in silence we cried. The SS stood guard. Their concern was the crate. It had to remain shut.
Returning home on that gray and dreadful day, my grandfather suffered a heart attack. The pain of losing Papa and the ordeal at the Gestapo had taken its toll.
For those who were cruelly separated from their loved ones. For the mothers and fathers who died with children in their arms.
For the scholars, teachers, and rabbis who are among the first seized.
For the resistors who fought the Nazis.
For the rescuers who risked their lives.
For the infants,
children and teenagers
who died before they could experience life.
For those who perished who are not Jews.
שוכן במרומים המצא מנוחה נכונה תחת כנפי השכינה במעלות קדוש יורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים לנשמות החיים ואחיותינו שנטבחו בשואה, אנשים, נשים וטוב, הקדושים וידיורים שנפלו בידי הרוצחים ונשפך דמם באושוויץ, מיידנק, טרבלינקה ובשאר מחנות השמד באירופה ושנחנקו ושנשרפו ושנקברו חיים. תהי מנוחתם. בסתר כנפיך לעולמים וצרור בצרור החיים וינוחו ושלום על משכבותיהם ונאמר אמן.
The mourner's Kaddish, or Kaddish Yatom in Hebrew, is an old prayer and one that has only grown in significance over time. There are several Kaddish prayers, and this one is unique to situations of mourners or mourning. Yet, as you may notice when you look inside a prayer book, the liturgy does not mention death. You may not be surprised, although you may be taken aback, that the prayer begins by detailing the greatness of God and ends with a future-oriented, forward-looking message of hope, of God bringing redemption to the world. Around the Middle Ages is when this prayer became associated with mourning, and it became the practice that mourners and those observing a yahrzeit or the anniversary of a death began to recite it at the beginning and at the end of a prayer service. Whether it was wise to make this the prayer or not, we can debate that, but there is wisdom in the tradition. And the wisdom of the tradition was saying to the mourner and to their community that you got to do this in public. Honor their memory. Do not shield your emotions or hold them inside, literally or figuratively. There is power in saying Kaddish. It is empowering to be the one who is there to provide a minyan, the required quorum to allow a mourner to recite this prayer, and thus creating not only a sacred space for prayer, but truly creating community. We say Kaddish together. Some say it, and some affirm its meaning and the memories and feelings subsumed within its words and the blank spaces in between by saying Amen. As we honor the memory of those who perished in the Shoah and also all that was lost and stolen from us, I encourage you all to stand if you're able and recite these words with me. May their memory be for a blessing and always impact our lives. Yitgadal v'yikadash shemei Rabbah, V'amra divrach u'ute v'amich malchute, b'chayachon u'v'yemechon u'v'chay dechol Beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'zman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabba mevrach le'olam omei maya. Yiparach v'yishtabach v'yitbar v'yitvonan v'yitnaseh. V'yitadar v'yitale v'yitalal shmei dikudsha b'richu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shurata. Tushbechata v'nechamata. Da'amiran ba'amala v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya. V'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Hoseh shalom b'mermav. Huya aseh shalom. Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen.
By early 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. As Americans and their allies moved east and Russian forces moved west, labor and death camps were liberated. Columns of thousands of men and women forced into death marches were freed. Bergen-Belsen was liberated on April 15, 1945. Of the 60,000 people who moved through the camp, 35,000 died in the first 3 months of 1945. What was left for those who remained? Hatikva, the hope. Listen to these free men and women, led by a rabbi of the 11th British Armored Division, sing to the future. Of the pre-war population of 9 million European Jews, 3 million remained, the survivors. You will hear two stories, stories of life and loss, endurance and hope, told by their children, Sylvia Dralick-Myers and Susan Zesch. Life began again.
Hi, my name is Maya Fliegler. I'm an 8th grader at Maple School in Northbrook, Illinois.
And I'm Jordan Fliegler. I'm a 6th grader at Maple School. We will interview our grandmother about her family, birth in a displaced persons camp, life in the camp, and journey to America. Her name is Sylvia Dralick-Myers. She is our Nana.
Nana's parents were born in Łódź, Poland. Her mother, Manya, came from a secular Jewish family. She was the only person in her family to attend high school. Her father, Alter, came from an Orthodox Jewish family. Manya Abramowitz and Alter Dralick were married in 1937. Their first child, Estera, was born in 1938. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. The Łódź ghetto was created in 1940. Before the war, Alter Dralick was a cabinet maker. In the ghetto, he was probably a laborer. Manya Dralick was a seamstress. By the time the ghetto was closed in 1944, of Alter's 6 siblings, only he remained. Of Manya's 5 siblings, 3 survived, including her sister Bina, who will later be called Betty, and her brother Jacob. No parents, no grandparents. Not their daughter Estera, who was deported from the ghetto in 1942 and disappeared. Manya and her sister and brother and her husband Alter were deported from the Łódź ghetto together for Auschwitz. When they arrived, men and women were separated at the ramp. Then the men and women were divided by their ability to work. Jacob disappeared. Alter was later deported to Buchenwald, where he was liberated in May 1945. Manya and her sister Bina remained together at Auschwitz. After a few months, they were sent to Bergen-Belsen and then to Salzwedel, a munitions camp in central Germany, where they were liberated in April 1945 by the American troops. The war in Europe ended on May 7, 1945. Manya and her sisters returned to Łódź in search of Alter and the remains of their family. Initially, they didn't find anyone. At the same time, Alter, who was liberated a few weeks after them, was also returned to the Łódź ghetto and looking for them. They were miraculously reunited by a survivor who told Alter that he had seen Manya and her sister. No longer safe in Poland, Alter and Manya Dralik and Manya's sister Bina, along with thousands of survivors, went to Germany. They settled in a displaced persons camp in the American sector of former German army barracks named Feldafing, one of the 3 camps near Munich. Nana, where were you born?
I was born in the displaced persons camp in Feldafing, Germany. The remnants of my family at the end of World War II were reborn in that camp. My birth certification states that my parents' address was Block 5A, Feldafing Displaced Persons Camp, American sector of Germany. Feldafing was one of 3 DP camps near Munich. Originally, the DP camps were not established only for Jewish survivors. The conditions were difficult, but eventually, through the involvement of the American government, Feldafing became the first DP camp that was only for Jewish survivors. Other camps followed.
What was life like in Feldafing?
Well, conditions improved, but they remained challenging for quite a long time. Before the war, Feldafing was a resort town. The camp actually used barracks occupied by German troops during the war. Initially, my parents lived in a large room shared by 6 to 8 people, no privacy. Eventually, everyone had their own room, but shared some kind of cooking facility. It took a long time for that to happen. The camp was run by an assortment of Jewish nationals, with the survivors organized by different groups, including the Jewish Labor Committee and the Bund. The Bund was a socialist organization. Food was supplied by the Americans. Even though it was only Jewish survivors in Feldafing, there were still many different points of view and desires. So get in line, prove who you are, wait your turn. The GPs were not passive. I want to say something about the phrase DP. A GP person means you don't belong anywhere, you're displaced. Anyway, they smuggled and exchanged black market goods to accrue money they would need for their journeys to new lands. From locals, they bought used cameras to photograph their new children. Most importantly, Jewish life was reborn. The highest Jewish birth rate anywhere in the world between 1945 and 1951 was in the DP camps. The first all Jewish hospital in the German DP camps was founded in Feldafing. Schools were started. They were both secular and religious. There were theater groups, an orchestra was formed, newspapers, magazines. Secular education and training was available even for the adults in evening school. So if they were working during the day, they could also work towards a different kind of a job. Feldafing was the site of the first elected Jewish camp committee, which was divided into several offices: housing, provisions, economics, culture, and legal matters. It was like a government arrangement. So, what did all of this mean to my family in Feldafing? My mother's sister, Bina, we called her Betty, met and married Reuben Fetterman, who was one of four brothers who survived the Holocaust. He had lost the remainder of his family. I was born in November of 1946, and in March of 1947, Bina and Reuben had their first child, Sarah. I now had, for the first time, an aunt, an uncle, and a cousin. Everyone knew that we could not remain in Feldafing permanently. Choices needed to be made.
You just mentioned that Holocaust survivors knew that what they had to do to begin their lives again somewhere. What were your parents thinking? How did they make the decision to come to the United States? Tell us about the journey.
Well, my father and mother had different opinions about where they should go. My father, remember, he came from an Orthodox background, desired going to Palestine, which eventually would be Israel, while my mother was looking towards America. In order to emigrate, you had to sign up with various organizations represented in the camp. And the destination, where you ended up, was dependent upon the sponsoring organization. The Bund, the socialist organization, was sending people to Australia, but my mother desired the US. In 1946, not long after I was born, we were scheduled to leave. According to my mother, the Greek survivors in the camp were opposed to the Bundists because they believed they were communists, and they tried to stop our departure. Approximately 30 to 40 people were scheduled to leave. Half of the group actually left in 1946, and they settled in New York. My mother believed that permission to leave had something to do with being tailors in the New York garment industry. We were left behind. We also lost our place in line because I became ill and I required surgery at 6 months old. Finally, in 1949, with the help of a Mr. Tabachinsky, our family received permission to leave for the United States. And we sailed from Bremerhaven on the General Hahn, a converted military ship. We were helped by HIAS, an international refugee association. Arriving through Boston, we didn't go through New York and see the Statue of Liberty, but we came through Boston. We eventually settled in Chicago, where my Aunt Bina and Uncle Reuben and cousin Sarah were waiting for us. They had already arrived there. We came with little, but the need to belong, to becoming American.
Thank you for telling.
I'm sorry.
I thought it was my line.
In 2016, Papa and I traveled to Poland, and specifically we went to Lodz and the historic Jewish cemetery, which was intact even after World War II. We found records of the burial of three of our family members, my grandfather, my mother's father, and an aunt and uncle who died in the ghetto. As for the other members of my family, we don't know for sure what became of them. Other than that, they were taken from the ghetto and did not survive. We attached a plaque to the interior wall of the cemetery to honor the members of the Abramowitz, Dralik, and Zellinger families lost during the Holocaust. The only full name on the plaque is Estera Gitla Drelic, the sister I never knew, but I always think about.
Thank you for telling your story. As your granddaughter's what?
Mm-hmm.
As your granddaughters, your story is ours now. We have an obligation to tell and retell our stories today and every day, so that happens then will never be repeated. As Nana says, never again, never forget.
Hi, I'm Susan Zash. I've been a member of KAM since 2001. I'm a native of the South Side of Chicago, and I teach at the University of Chicago. All four of my grandparents arrived in Chicago from various places in Eastern Europe between 1906 and 1913. Both of my grandfathers came into the United States through Galveston, Texas, which was a port of entry for lots of Eastern European Jews, and that's how they ended up in Chicago. Each of them came with several siblings, but from much larger families. In fact, we have a picture of my grandfather, Max Gazesh, as a child in Lodz, Poland. And in the picture, there are 8 siblings, 4 of whom came to Chicago. One died young of cancer here, Isaac. Another brother, Leib, went back to Poland in 1914 because he missed his wife and was afraid he couldn't raise enough money to bring her and his daughters. And then the daughter, who's in the center of the picture that you'll see, was also stayed in Chicago and had a family here. So my grandparents all met in Chicago. My grandmothers were from Riga, Latvia, and from Kiev, then Russia, now Ukraine. And they got married here in Chicago and started their families. And you can see their wedding pictures. They look pretty dapper. Max Zesh and Lena Wolfson are wearing pretty snazzy hats. And they got married in 1917. And Max Cronenberg and Celia Kislev also look very serious in that picture. Max Cronenberg went to work in a metal plating factory. His 2 brothers were house painters who had come along with him. House painters were called schmearers in those days. And Max Zesh opened a bakery. They were so poor when he opened his first bakery at Potomac and Rockwell, as my dad used to tell the story, that my dad, as a baby, and his mother actually slept on top of the ovens in the back of the bakery before they could afford an apartment. Both families, however, really suffered from the fact that once US immigration law changed in 1922 and 24, they couldn't send for any of their siblings to come to Chicago from Europe and begin new lives here. In fact, my grandfather, Max Zesh, had a chance to go back and visit family in the late 1920s. My great-grandmother, great-grandmother Manya Kislev, who ran a corset shop on Division Street, she also was making enough money that she went back to Kiev with one of her daughters to visit family there. But this becomes tragic, as anybody with a similar family history knows, when the Nazis start first discriminating against Jews in Germany and then invading Poland and taking over much of Eastern Europe. In fact, of the 4 families, the family from Riga, Latvia, the family from Kiev in Russia, the family from Vyshkov in Poland, and the family from Lodz, the only family in which anybody survived were the Zeshes from Lodz. We know, for example, that when the Nazis invaded Vyshkov in September 1939, they pretty much killed all the Jews in town immediately. We don't know what happened to the relatives in either Riga or Kiev. So the reason the Zesh family survived, a bunch of first cousins of my dad's, was because they were in a ghetto run by the capo of the ghetto, Chaim Rumkowski, as an industrial center for the Nazi war machine. The Zesh family were all bakers, and that's pretty much what they did in the ghetto, was had a family bakery. But how did they survive? Well, one relative, a first cousin of my dad's, and her son Henry, who's the oldest of my generation in the family and still survives in his late 80s living in Rome, they escaped east. They went across the lines into the Soviet Union, spent a year in Siberia, spent the rest of the war in Central Asia, and showed up at Lodz at the end of the war to see who was still alive. Other family members, my dad's cousin Hirsch, who's in a picture that you see from the Henrik Ross collection of Lodz photographs, volunteered to be sent to Germany to work in agriculture. A cousin's husband, Abe Jacobovich, escaped the ghetto to be part of the partisans. And then the rest of the survivors were largely, like Hirsch, young and relatively healthy. And the Nazis sent them off to be in slave labor camps instead of being sent, as their parents and younger siblings mostly were, straight to Auschwitz to be exterminated. Now, I'm going to tell you about two of the brothers who survived the war and came to Chicago. They were the children of my grandfather's brother who had gone back to Poland. And they survived because, as I said, Hirsch volunteered to go work in agriculture in Germany as part of one of the slave labor schemes. And Motek, who took the name Morris when he came here, was taken out of the ghetto and deported, but not to Auschwitz, to a slave labor camp. They were both survived these horrible experiences and were liberated respectively from Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald in April 1945, and then spent the next 3 years in the DP camp in Frankfurt am Main, where they reunited with another cousin and some other people they knew from Lodz. And finally, in the late 1940s, 47, 48, they started getting letters from my grandfather here in Chicago, letters in Yiddish. He had found them through HIAS, and he told them he was going to bring them to Chicago. By that time, my dad, Morizesh, was a lawyer, and he and his father worked every scheme they could because the Displaced Persons Act was not allowing that many people in yet until after 1950. And they ultimately were able to bring more than 12 first cousins and their spouses here to Chicago. Now, because they were bakers in Europe, that was the family trade, my grandfather connected them with various bakeries around Chicago. A number of them went to work for Kaufmann's. Eventually, one of the cousins actually married Kaufmann when she was widowed. And Hirsch and his wife Masha established the Lincolnwood Bakery, which maybe some people in this audience remember. And another cousin, Sally, and her husband, Abe Jacobovich, ran Thorndale Deli for many years. And to me, Thorndale Deli was part of this story because when, as an adult, I was living on the North Side and I used to go buy food at Thorndale Deli on Sundays, Abe Jacobovich, or Sally, if she was there, would always introduce me to the customers because they were so grateful to my grandfather for having brought them to the United States. So that's part of the family heritage, was that we had tons of cousins who were our second cousins, the children of these survivors of the Holocaust. And one of the things my cousin Erwin reminded me of today is that when we were kids and we'd go to family parties, there would be like, 18, 20 of us second cousins all running around somebody's backyard. And it seemed like there were so many of us. But as Erwin said, imagine how many more there would have been had more of our parents' first cousins survived the Holocaust. So that's the story of our family, that we were lucky to have survivors. We were lucky to have a family base in Chicago that my father and grandfather were able to bring the relatives to, and here we are.
Oh,
This concludes our program in remembrance of the Shoah. We thank you for joining us this evening and hope you will join us again next year. I'm Ruth Bloom, convener of the planning group. If you would like to join us during the year to continue exploring the history of the Holocaust and our family's experience during it, please contact us through the KAMIZ Israel website. We welcome your participation. Thank you and be well.